I think Trump exaggerates his ability to do a deal. And one of the problems he's got is that actually the positions of Russia and Ukraine are totally incompatible. It is very different from circumstances in which you have a country that's been clearly defeated, as Germany had been in the two world wars.
Now, as we've been reporting, Russia is set to declare victory tomorrow in its war with Ukraine, 3 years on from when the invasion began, or at least a claimed victory. This comes after last week's preliminary meetings in Riyadh between senior representatives of the United States and Russia. Donald Trump, meanwhile, says he can end the war through negotiation by Easter. So we thought we'd open up the archive and take a look at previous efforts and peace conferences over the last 100 years. And joining me now to do just that is the Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman. Hello to you.
Hi.
I suppose, really, in modern times, people look back to June 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles was signed to bring an end to the First World War. Here's how a recent documentary by France 24 looked back at those events.
Something else missing from the conference, those who'd been defeated. Germany, which had signed the armistice in November 1918, had to rely on US mediation for the kind of peace it wanted. But when the German delegation arrived in Versailles, they were in for a shock.
The Germans didn't take part in the conference, but they were invited to come later, in May 1919. On the 7th, they received a draft treaty at the Trianon Palace Hotel. They couldn't express themselves directly. They had to do it in written form, so there was no dialogue between the Allies, the members of the conference, and Germany.
As long as I suppose, excluding one of the main parties to the conflict has its parallels with what Donald Trump's been talking about doing in Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, I don't think he really believes he can get a conclusion of this conference without Ukraine. I think Versailles, after all, is exactly what Putin doesn't want in some respects, in that there was an armistice, a ceasefire, with the peace conference coming later. Putin wants all the details sorted out before a ceasefire. Versailles normally stands as an example of the danger of a one-sided peace, in that, and people often point to the reparations as the big consequence, which actually was French revenge for reparations that had been imposed on them after 1871. So it's a very different, this was a massive, let's recast the world order. It was about self-determination. It was about new international organizations. I think what we're going to see in discussions over Ukraine is something much more limited and modest. That being said, I think the Russians, again, would like a recasting of the international order. I just don't think Trump can give it to them.
Yeah, it's also interesting, you mentioned reparations. Trump at the moment appears to be demanding some sort of economic reparations from Ukraine. So rather than being, if you like, the unbiased referee of a negotiation, he's actually got skin in the game.
He does. That may not, in the end, be a bad thing for the Ukrainians, of course. And this isn't too unusual. One might note that Lend-Lease, which a lot of the American support under Biden was based on, had quite a price for the UK. They were still paying off the debt well into the Cold War. So that bit's not unusual. We also should note, although I don't expect it will get very far in a direct negotiation, is that the Ukrainians are demanding reparations for the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage Russia has done to them.
I suppose because of the parties involved, the greatest parallels have been drawn to the Yalta conference, the second major conference following Tehran, which sought to make agreements at the end of the Second World War. Let's listen to a newsreel from February 1945.
Mr. Churchill arrives direct from Malta. The Kremlin guards form a guard of honor and march past in true Red Army style after being inspected by Mr. Churchill and President Roosevelt. The meetings were to be held in the beautiful Livadia Palace, once the home of a Russian prince. The former state banqueting hall is now the conference room. The American Secretary of State, Stettinius, and the American Ambassador, Averell Harriman, arrive with their British equivalents, Mr. Eden and Sir Archibald Clark Carr. Finally, into the palace courtyard sweeps the long black car bearing one of the greatest military leaders of all time, Marshal of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin.
Of course, Sir Lawrence Freedman, there you had allies meeting, or people who had been allies at the end of the war meeting to discuss the future. But even then, there was perhaps a slight perception that Churchill was being cold-shouldered a bit or excluded by Russia and America.
Well, Roosevelt was pretty poorly by this time, and he didn't have much time left to live. Churchill was interested in doing deals with Stalin. Stalin commanded the scene. The big issue, or one of the big issues, was the nature of the European peace. And Yalta is now remembered, and why you see lots of references to it at the moment, by the abandonment of East European countries, the acceptance that there would be an Iron Curtain, and in particular of Poland. After all, we'd initially gone to war because of Poland. Poland had been divided by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, and it came under Soviet control at the end of the war. So that is why you see lots of references to Yalta as some sort of great betrayal now.
And some people are drawing direct parallels with Trump's attitude towards Ukraine and Russia. Yes,
I mean, again, the difficulty with Trump is that, unlike Roosevelt, who was an internationalist, Trump is a nationalist. He's looking at this to see what he can get out of it for the US, and imagines himself as a great deal maker. You know, the only reason I'm cautious about a lot of this is we haven't actually got a proper negotiation going yet. You've just had talks about talks. And I don't think the actual deal that's going to come into view is going to represent what happened after 1918 or what happened after 1945, because the circumstances are so different. I think Trump exaggerates his ability to do a deal. And one of the problems he's got is that actually the positions of Russia and Ukraine are totally incompatible. It is very different from circumstances in which you have a country that's been clearly defeated, as Germany had been in the two world wars.
And sort of another parallel, really, I suppose, is to what extent you can trust the Russians. There was, of course, another conference after the Second World War in Potsdam, where Allied leaders agreed to the division of Germany and how to end the World War II. But I think it's fair to say that the president at the time, Harry Truman, looked back pretty ruefully on the negotiations with the Russians and Joseph Stalin.
I was there to try to arrange things to implement the Yalta meeting and implement the agreements that were made not only at Yalta but at Potsdam. We made 48 agreements altogether, 32 at Potsdam and 16 at Yalta, on the peace of the world. And the Russians agreed to every single one of those agreements, made a written record of their agreement to every one of those 48 agreements, and they broke every one of them. And so that's one of the things that caused the Cold War.
And that is, once again, a big issue now, making sure that Russia, whatever's agreed, stays within that agreement rather than presses into the rest of Europe, isn't it, Sir Lawrence?
Yeah, I mean, I think Potsdam is in a way, as Truman was saying, when you think of the start of the Cold War, it was also the moment when the Americans realized that they had the atomic bomb. News of that came through during Potsdam. It was also a point when Churchill lost the election and Attlee took over. So it's a time of great flux. And it's fair to say that Truman was more suspicious of the Soviets than Roosevelt had been. And you're already seeing the souring of relations. The problem, as you mentioned, is then agreement was going to come either through the new United Nations, which had already been established, or the balance of power. The problem we have with Ukraine is, this dominates a lot of the discussion, is if the Russians agree to respect in the future Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, things they promised in the past and ignored, what happens when they break that? And who's going to stand up for Ukraine in those circumstances? Zelensky's view is the Americans have to be involved. The question is, how much can the Europeans do to shore up Ukraine and give them confidence in the future without the Americans? And therefore, one of the interesting things, one of the things Starmer will be talking about when he goes later in the week, is it's not so much a negotiation between Ukrainians and Russians as a negotiation between Europeans and Americans as well as Ukrainians.
And there's also the question of how obligated we should feel towards Ukraine, given the history after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Negotiations continued after that collapse in 1991 and were finalised in the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in 1994 in Budapest, which appeared to offer Ukraine guarantees. Here's a report from the Associated Press.
After more than a decade of negotiations, Russia and the US finally put pen to paper. The signing put into force the Strategic Arms Treaty, or START, the first ever accord to reduce long-range nuclear weapons. START 1 calls for the US and former Soviet Union to eliminate 9,000 long-range nuclear warheads, or 1/3 of their arsenals, over the next 7 years. At the same time, the Ukraine formally renounced nuclear arms by joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Ukraine inherited almost 2,000 warheads when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. President Clinton heralded both signings as the arrival of a new and safe era.
Skeptics once claimed that the nuclear threat would actually grow after the Soviet Union dissolved. But because of the wisdom and statesmanship of the leaders who joined me here, the skeptics have been proven wrong.
So, Lawrence, with hindsight, was it a mistake of Ukraine to go along with that agreement in Budapest?
They didn't have a lot of choice. They were under pressure by the Americans as well as the Russians. And in truth, it would have been difficult and expensive for them to be a full-blown nuclear power. But the Ukrainians look back at this with a lot of resentment because they still made the gesture, and they were offered security guarantees or assurances was the word actually used. And the Soviet and the Russians ignored this. And when the Russians were asked why they ignored, they said, well, after 2014, Ukraine wasn't the same country. And the promises they'd given to a different sort of government. And that's the problem we're going to get, is that if Putin wants to ignore an international agreement, he will find language to do so. And unless there's pushback, of which there was only limited amount when Budapest was broken in practice with the annexation of Crimea in March 2014. And the pushback was some economic sanctions. It wasn't anything that seriously discomforted Putin.
So, Lawrence Freedman, thank you very much indeed. Looking ahead there and back at peace talks and their relevance to Ukraine.